Are we live? Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of APA Idaho's 14th annual conference. I am very pleased to introduce to you today Ryan Pilgrim. Ryan is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Idaho. Her research focuses on issues of inequality in the West and works to imagine how we can create thriving rural communities. This is sponsored by the Blue Cross of Idaho Foundation for Health. Thank you to all our sponsors this year. Ryan's book, Pushed Out, Contested Development and Rural Gentrification, has been flying off the shelves. And we are pleased to bring it to you as part of this year's conference. In fact, Ryan had to, I think, locate several of the books in a warehouse somewhere in order for us to bring it to our first 50 registrants. So those are coming. The book is back ordered, but we're happy to be able to have provided them to you. And those who weren't among the first 50 registrants, you will get a discount code in your swag bag, along with your hat and all the other groovy stuff we have coming your way. Despite being well-written and well-researched, for me and as a planner, I really appreciated the human element that came through her writing in this book. And I wanted to read a quick passage that really spoke to me. There are so many ways to measure the change in rural communities in the face of amenity migration, but do they account for the loss of camaraderie and community cohesion? And that's really what I loved about her book, how it really told a human story. So with that, I'm pleased to bring Ryan Pilgrim to us at this year's conference. Welcome, Ryan, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen here. It might take me just a couple seconds to get going. Oops. How does that look on your end, everybody? Is that okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Fantastic. I think to move. Okay. So I just would like to thank Erin for inviting me, and Liz, who's working as our moderator today, has been working behind the scenes to make sure everything runs smoothly. So I just want to thank them both. And yeah, the opportunity to share my work with you. So I'm going to be talking primarily today about a book that I started researching in 2015 that just came out last spring, but that's a topic that has been really important to me for a long time. And I'll talk about why Dover matters to me and why I picked it as a case study. But the background, the short version, is that my book project examines a small town in North Idaho, Dover, to examine the changes that took place in that community using a sociological lens. So I'm a sociologist. So for background, Dover was home to a huge sawmill that operated between about 1920 and 1990. It was closed down at that period, and then it burned down. And the site sat vacant until 2005, when the city council rezoned it from agricultural land to planned use development. And because of that rezoning, Dover was jolted almost overnight from a sleepy little town with about 500 people, had a post office and a church and a community center, to a quote, unique upscale development consisting of 11 distinct neighborhoods and offering custom waterfront homes. And this cover image that from the book, I think, illustrates what I cared about and what I found interesting about Dover. So you can see the juxtaposition between the new sort of craftsman style home and one of the older garages and vehicles in Dover. So that juxtaposition between new and old, between maybe different class identities. And I think it's indicative of kind of the talk that I'm going to give today. So just so that we're all on the same page, I'm talking about this town that's in northern Idaho. So it's on the shores of Lake Pend Oreille. So you can see I've pulled it here. And then more specifically, Dover is, I think of Dover as where the lake and the river kind of come, where the river starts and the lake ends. Most people think it's the Long Bridge, but so this is a map of the community that was created for my book. I'm just going to point out a few points for you because I'll be talking about those. So this is Old Dover. It's built on the grid system. This is where the mill was. And the community of Old Dover really used this particular place in their community as a public space. So this is where their city beach was. They called it Sandy Beach, and the bluff. We'll talk about the bluff and why it matters to the community. And then the development, the PUD that went in, is all the area in the dark black that's outlined here in the marina. So I always like to point out that it's on Ponderay River, because on the developer's side, they just cut off the side of the river and call it the lake. But I don't know, that's, I think, an interesting difference. So I wanted to use Dover to answer the question, why would this community rezone? And that's really the only question that drove me to do this research. Dover's, I think, a really interesting case study of change in the rural West, because here's this, unlike a lot of places where development is happening in unincorporated areas or the areas that, you're working with the county commissioners, Dover was an incorporated small city. The reasons they incorporated are complicated, but this land that they sat on, or that the mill had, they had a lot of power to rezone it. And the city council was made up entirely of working class people from Dover who had deep, deep roots in the community. And so I always wondered, like, why rezone and lose your beach? If you're so upset about losing the beach, why rezone in the first place? And I became kind of obsessed with that question. And so to that end, I did a lot of research to try and answer it. So I did interviews with over 30 people, hour-long interviews with new residents, old mayors, new mayors, city council members, city clerks, the developer, people in charge of the wetland development, people in charge of the sewer development. I was trying to understand this change from as many angles as I could. I think maybe indicative of that, I ended up interviewing the state geologist because I became obsessed with the geology of the area. I also was a tour guide in North Idaho for like 10 years. So I've always been obsessed with Lake Missoula and thinking about the bluff and its relationship. So thinking about change from, I think the second chapter of the book's called something like A Short History of the Last 62 Million Years. So trying to understand these kind of broad elements. I also did a lot of archaeological research. So the Bonner County Historical Society was very helpful, city council minutes, archaeological site reports. I did some interviews with the Kalispell Tribe's cultural resource manager, and just spent time in the community one day with the Dover girls. So you'll see some of my pictures that I took from the community hall. And so this was a mini-year project of me collecting data and analyzing data, theoretically, to answer this simple question of why did this community rezone? And I should want to add that I have a unique position in Dover, what sociologists and anthropologists sometimes call an insider-outsider position. So I moved to Sandpoint, Dover area when I was a freshman in high school, and I ended up riding the Dover bus. I lived in kind of a no man's land between Dover and Sandpoint. So I rode the Dover school bus and got to know a lot of the kids in Dover and became close friends. I've remained pretty close friends with a number of people in Dover. And so, I had some access, some entree into the community, some trust built when I went in there to start doing my interviews, to start asking some of these questions. But I also waited to do this project until after I had tenure, because I knew it was kind of emotionally laden, and I wanted to be able to bring those emotions that people had into the story and feel sort of secure in my place in the university before tackling that. So I'm going to be using a couple terms today, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page around those terms. So this project is a case study, which basically means I've taken this community, Dover, and I think of it as a sort of ideal type. It tells us something interesting by learning a lot about one place. It may tell us interesting things about other places. I'm also going to be using the term rural gentrification, which is pretty standard in my field, but I know comes with a connotation that sometimes causes an emotional reaction in people. So for me, the definition of gentrification that I'm using requires two elements. So the first is a demographic shift from populations from urban and suburban areas to rural ones. So demographic shift, people moving. But that's not sufficient for it to be considered rural gentrification. The second element requires an influx of population, of that influx to be people with social and economic power in rural areas, where they are able to assert that power over the interests of the more working class community. So it's population, but it's also about power. And finally, the idea of the new and old West. So the idea of the new West is useful to me because it describes the shift from extractive industries of the old West to what happened starting in a lot of places in around the 1980s, where we see a job loss in extractive industries. And this has sort of created a pretty divided American West, one where there are small towns that are losing population, some with persistent poverty, and others that are growing and getting this kind of new West or booming status. And I just found this quote so useful sort of in envisioning that. Included in the New West are images of ranchers, horses, and dusty cattle drives. Today, the New West conveys images of residents wearing Patagonia fleeces and Western jeans, telecommuters and professionals with laptops working remotely. So towards the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about a picnic that happened in Dover, the old Dover picnic, when after the development came in, and one of the interviewees pretty much came up with this theory on their own, just watching that picnic take place. So ultimately, what I'm interested in doing, or what my book project was interested in doing, is understanding the mechanisms that created change in Dover. So like I said, Dover, I think, is particularly interesting because of the power that the city council had in making decisions. And they wielded that power in certain ways. But why rezone when they had a lot to lose and really not a lot to gain personally from this? But I want to start the story here, thinking about the Kalispell Tribe. I think we need to be really careful with these ideas like rural gentrification, or the title of the book, Pushed Out, because they implicitly posit loss is starting in 1980. When clearly for Indigenous people in the West, this loss started much earlier and has been profound in scope. The mill could move to Dover in the 1920s, precisely because the Kalispell people had been forced off it. I like using this image here of the sturgeon nose canoes that the Kalispell people used, because these canoes are found only 2 places in the whole world. They're designed to be able to navigate the intense winds and reeds and water conditions on the Pend Oreille watershed. Thinking about the link between people and place. So the Kalispell Nation and the Army Corps of Engineers, who did part of the archaeological exploration of the mill site, noted that the Kalispell people wintered precisely where the mill was located for at least 2,000 years. And the Kalispell people were only removed by way of state hunting laws in about 1930 from the Dover area. And I interviewed some of the old timers who were in their 90s at this point, who talked about trading with the Kalispell people, that the Kalispell people would set up a summer encampment close to Dover. They would go and trade with them, right? So that this is still like part of our collective memory in communities like Dover, but it doesn't often get talked about. So I'm going to be using, putting in a theoretical lens to discuss what happened in Dover. So I somehow have managed to delete the slide that should be before this one. So I'm just going to wing it a little bit. But what I'm using, so I did all this research, and one of the really important parts of what happened in Dover was infrastructural decline. And I'll talk about that. But so much of my research, so much of my interviews were about this decline, this frustration about loss. And I was trying to understand what that meant, right? Why would a community lose something like that? And came upon Harvey's theory of the spatial fix. So Harvey is a geographer thinking about the role of capital and space. And he argues that capitalism build a space for for a landscape, for its functioning, only to destroy that space so that it can be redeveloped, reimagined, and be able to extract resources out of that space again. So he doesn't see it as a three-step theory, but in my work and in my book, I re-envision it as sort of a stage, right? First step, you build a space. Second step, that space is destroyed. Third, people with wealth can come in and reinvest in that space to create wealth, but that's uneven and unshared. And I think that really matters because it helps us understand the importance of maintaining strong infrastructures for rural communities and people on the economic margins because of where their vulnerabilities lie. So when we think about step one, capitalism has to build a fixed space. We can think about the settlement of the American West. So I've got some images here from Sandpoint, the Sandpoint Mill, the Humberg Mill. The settlement of the American West is often sort of romanticized as this era of democracy and opportunity where diverse groups of Euro-American settlers could create new lives and new prosperity for themselves in a space freed from the economic and social structures of more developed spaces. But of course, the reality is far more complex. A detailed site report from the Northern Pacific Railroads being built around Sandpoint found that the site held 2,600 Chinese and 1,400 Caucasian workers. These workers would be housed in separate quarters, but after the railroad was completed, most Chinese workers came back to the places that they had built along the railroad to settle and build lives. In North Idaho, in many communities in North Idaho, these Chinese settlers were run out of town by white settlers. One local newspaper report expressed outrage that a Chinese restaurant had the audacity to hire a white woman as a server. Advertisements in those same papers, these are all papers that I was looking at in North Idaho, Sandpoint and Hope area. Advertisements in those same papers made special note that the staff in their shops included, quote, no Chinese workers. This anti-Chinese sentiment took more violent forms. In 1887, a group of 34 Chinese miners were massacred on the Snake River, and nobody was ever convicted of that crime. Today, we know that Bonner County is one of the whitest countries in the nation at 96.5%. And I grew up in Sandpoint. I lived there during the sort of the height of the Aryan Nation years. Really, I think informed much of the work I do professionally. But you know, there's this kind of sentiment often that you hear that, well, North Idaho has always been white. And I think thinking about history helps us contextualize how and why communities look the way that they do. And when we think about, you know, sort of this mid-period, this period of building a space for capitalism, the population in Idaho was equally split between indigenous people, Chinese people, and white people. So what causes those things to change and shift so radically? But of course, the railroad comes in, and it's not just settlers who buy up most of the land that the Kalispell people are pushed off of. Here's a picture of the old Dover Mill. Instead, the Northern Pacific Railroad lobbied the US government for subsidies to construct the line. So the Northern Pacific was given over 40 million acres of land. For every mile of track they built, the federal government handed over 12,800 acres, double that in territories, which Idaho would have been. The Northern Pacific then sold most of the land it was given by the US government to just a handful of corporations, who would then in turn use it to cut timber. So the empire of Frederick Weyerhaeuser is still a pretty household name in most North Idaho communities, and it was built from these land sales. In 1894, Weyerhaeuser bought 900,000 acres of railroad land. And in all, he purchased 1.5 million acres of timberland from the Northern Pacific Railroad, about 80% of its holdings, making him the second largest landholder of timberland in the US. In most places, Weyerhaeuser paid just $6 an acre for this land, and he didn't pay that much on land that wasn't timbered. He was also a close friend and neighbor of the railroad baron, James Hill, also known as the empire builder of the Northwest. So the fate of Dover then is a case study of this history of the American West. The Humbird Mill, which was in Sandpoint, was built along the Lake Pend Oreille and was partially owned by Weyerhaeuser. Most of the land used to supply the mill was either purchased directly from the Northern Pacific, and while the records from the Dover Mill have all burned up a number of times, the Humbird Mill showed that the almost 159,000 acres that they acquired, they paid less than $6 an acre for. So for comparison, you could buy 2 universal wolf extracting forceps or 3 ventilated beards on a wire for $6. In short, pretty unimaginably huge tracts of land were essentially given away to the already rich and connected in North Idaho and across the American West. And I think that's part of the story that we need to tell. How did this land, what did it look like? How was it accessed? And how does that help us understand the story of where we're at today? So these are pictures of houses being floated upriver to become Dover. So a lot of this story starts in the 20th century, but it's obviously embedded in a much longer story. Dover was literally barged upstream to its current location after a fire burned down the mill in Laclede and about 10 miles downstream. So the mill owner in Laclede took his insurance money. He'd cut most of the timber around Laclede and transported the buildings that survived the fire upriver and started the mill in Dover. His name was A.C. White, and he was pretty beloved in Dover and still is. So lured by this work at mills, thousands of new immigrants mostly show up to work in the woods. And so I think it's important to point out what the life of those workers was like. Working conditions in lumber camps was terribly dangerous. A number of the people I interviewed talked about deaths in their family from, quote, working in the woods. Working conditions are pretty abysmal. So men worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. And the dining hall in these lumber camps was a bright spot, but I think it betrays the demands of the job. The USDA recommended that men consume 8,000 calories a day to keep up their work. A recommended breakfast included all the following: oatmeal mush, donuts, rye bread, corn bread, syrup, cornmeal cakes, apple butter, creamed potatoes, coffee, and codfish cakes. After supper, the men could look forward to retiring to their bunkhouse, where they had to bring their own bedding, and their beds were filled with straw. The camps were usually infested with lice. There was no running water. There was nowhere to wash your clothing. Even years later, men would describe the stench of everybody taking off their socks at the end of the day that had not been washed for the entire season and hanging them around the fire to dry. By the late 19-teens, the radical workers of the world, the Wobblies, started to organize in North Idaho, focusing on a fight for an 8-hour workday. When they aren't successful in their demands, they start a strike at work in the summer of 1918 and use industrial sabotage. So in Dover, 20 workers become embroiled in this union fight and stand trial for their involvement with the Wobblies. They are cutting timber too short. They're cutting, making the timber or the lumber like 7 feet instead of 8 feet long, so that they can't sell it. Despite not winning officially, they are given an 8-hour workday and a 6-hour workday week. And millwork becomes much more stabilized after this period. And this is really when Dover begins to flourish. It has its own school, as you can see here. Here are the rows of mill houses. The picture on the bottom, you can see the bluff here. And then that would be the beach down in the corner. There was a baseball diamond. Their team were called the Dover River Rats. So I think it's important to point out that it's not the settlers then who bought up the majority of the land that was taken from the Kalispell people. The Northern Pacific sold most of it to just a handful of corporations. But the people of Dover, like many people in the American West, fought to create a sense of community for themselves here. And I think these two pictures are indicative of that community and the importance of it to them. So one is a play that the kids are putting on at the community hall. And the second is the Dover Annual Picnic, which has played an important role in their community for 100 years. When I talked to the people of Old Dover, what mattered to them was community. They thought Dover was beautiful. They think the lake is beautiful, but really it is a backdrop to the lives that they created for themselves. Lives that were often not exactly, I don't think, what the Northern Pacific envisioned when they laid the railroad. But Dover saw a steep decline, right? So thinking about, so we build a space, then what is the purpose of letting those spaces decline? What function might decline serve? So this sense of camaraderie and sort of shared success changes in the 1980s with a number of economic crises. The most significant, I would argue, and least discussed cause of this downturn, particularly in the timber industry, is automation and consolidation. So when I was doing my research, I wanted all this information, right? I'm trying to make sense of all these things. And I found the number of mills that had closed down between 1979 and 2006, and it didn't really surprise me, right? So in 1979, there were 133 mills in North Idaho. By 2006, there were only 38. And that tracked with my experience and my memory of living in North Idaho. But the next figure I found, I found it so surprising that I made myself find it like 3 different ways. Because while the number of mills shrank from 133 to 38 in that period, the amount of lumber actually produced in North Idaho grew every single year between 1979 and 2006. And I stopped in 2006 because that's when the Great Recession in the housing market kind of shrank. And so it just made the most sense to sort of stop there. But in 1979, North Idaho was producing about 900,000 board feet of lumber. By 2006, it was 1.7 million board feet. These seeming contradictions are explained by the closure of small mills and the growth of much larger ones that needed fewer people to do the same work. The industry responded to increased wages and other demands in the global market by this rapid technological invention. One researcher found in their economic analysis that nationwide during the 1980s, production in timber mills rose by 2% a year, while employment at those same mills declined by 2% a year. The irony, of course, if you've watched movies from the 1980s or were alive then, like some of us, was that in many places, the 1980s were a place of economic gain. But for working class people in extractive industries, particularly in the rural West, this period marked a dramatic downturn. So at precisely this moment where timber workers were becoming, it was a pretty solid, prosperous job, these jobs began disappearing and people were replaced by machines. And it wasn't just the timber industry, it's other extractive industries that are important in North Idaho, particularly mining. So in Dover, the mill unionized in 1988 and then was closed down by 1989. These changes are dire for the community because there's a loss of employment. One of my respondents, I described this, that he watched the community change from having pickup trucks in the parking lot to cars in Dover after the mill closed. So people who relied on the timber industry for work mostly blamed the federal government for their job losses. Often standards to protect fish and wildlife got much of the attention. That this process of automation and consolidation happened at the same time that the environmental movement gained a foothold in Northwest politics meant that federal policies were often held accountable for job losses, despite evidence that there is still a substantial amount of timber being produced there. But it doesn't really matter because for the people of Dover, the community is left not only without jobs, but also with infrastructure that is tied directly to the mill itself. So this is the part of my research that I thought things really started coming together for me, trying to understand what was happening. So in 1973, Dover residents received a letter from the mill owner stating that they would cease supplying water to non-company owned properties. So short of walking to the lake with a bucket, there was no other way for the community to access water. The mill had been providing water to the community since 1921. And this letter came as a total shock to people. All these documents that I have are from people in the community who this was such a crisis moment for their community that some people still have files of all these documents, and they were nice enough to let me use them for my project. Residents found a provision in the law that said if an entity's been providing water, they cannot quit providing that water as long as residents pay their bills. And even like 40 years later, some of the residents could pull out their bills that they had paid in 1975 and show the canceled check because they were that concerned about losing access to the water. One of the things that's particularly kind of troubling about this letter, letting people know that they are not going to be providing water anymore, is that the mill owner had fairly recently upgraded the water system and got a new tank. They'd done it in the 1950s. So less than 25 years later, they're threatening to cut off water. That company sells the mill to Shamrock Development or Shamrock Investment. And they send a letter out to residents letting them know with this phrase that read as particularly ominous: we have no plans for any change that will continue. We have no plans for any change and will continue to keep the water running, quote, as best we can at current condition. That condition was a system that was described as ancient in 1950. The water pipes that Shamrock Investment inherited when they bought the property, the pipes they weren't planning on upgrading were wooden pipes. Residents in Dover described the water system as being, quote, fixed, repaired, run over, broken, dug up many times over the years. By the 1980s, the water tank leaked so severely that there was a regular creek flowing from it. The system provided so little water pressure that in many parts of town, people couldn't even flush their toilets. An engineering firm that residents brought in to examine the system concluded that, quote, essentially you have no water system. So when Shamrock Investment said they would keep the water running as best they could, they were referring to conditions so deteriorated that the newspaper described them as, quote, something more at home in the third world country than in North Idaho. It's probably no surprise then that in 1986, the Panhandle Health District found bacteria in their water supply and put residents under a boil order. These residents had no way of knowing that that boil order would remain in place for 6 years. So one of my interviewees was in kindergarten when the boil order started, and she was in 5th grade by the time it ended. Here's a picture of Craig Hofmeister, who was on the city council then, and it was one of his jobs to try and keep the water pump running. Every time the power would go out in North Idaho, and the power goes out a lot up in that area, it would turn the pump off to the water system. The pump room would flood. They would have to bail out sometimes 7 feet of water, try to dry out the equipment and get it restarted. Craig liked to point out that he worked like as an assistant for people with developmental disabilities. He did not know how to run a water system. But so when the power would go out, the city of Dover would often lose all access to running water for 24 to 72 hours, pretty frequently. So in other words, the loss of the mill wasn't just about a loss of the job. Since the town's inception, the mill had been this important economic life force, and the people of Dover felt intensely betrayed by the owner's abdication and negligence. In 1992, a fire burned away all of what was left of the old mill site and permanently sort of scarred the community's sense of pride. This town, a lot of residents talked about how quiet the town was once the mill closed. So they were used to the noise of the mill always in the background, and they found it hard to sleep because of the quiet. The city of Dover was not a city at this time, but they were forced to incorporate because they needed to fix their water system and they needed grants for low-income communities to do that. So to be able to qualify for grants, they had to be an actual town. So they incorporate to become an actual town so that they can start working on these grants for low-income communities. And it takes them a long time to successfully get the grant. But during that period, there's all sorts of other infrastructure problems happening. So one of the big ones that was upsetting the community was the bridge over the railroad tracks, Highway 2 between Sandpoint and Spokane, if you, what I consider go the back way, was falling away. The bridge was losing chunks of concrete that when I was interviewing the old mayor, he said were the size of the table. And the table was at least like 2 feet by 2 feet that we were sitting on. They would call him in the middle of the night and he would go out there and have to flag the bridge to try and keep cars from falling onto the railroad tracks below. His wife was the transportation director for the school district at the time. And she said she lived in constant fear that she was going to get a radio call that a busload of kids had gone off the bridge and onto the railroad tracks below. And it occurred to me that I was one of the kids riding the bus when she was concerned that they might go off the road. So it wasn't just, so they have their water system is under a boil order for 6 years. Their bridge is crumbling. Gets on America's failing infrastructure. It becomes a famous bridge. And then there's also the problem with their sewer. The sewer system, the leach field begins backing up and bubbling effluent. And so it gets red tagged by the Panhandle Health District as well. So we have this community that's having all these infrastructure crises and this very small group of people desperately trying to keep their community working. So my project started with a really simple question. Why was Dover rezoned? And I was really shocked that no one I interviewed really knew the answer to that question. You know, I will also say that many of the city council records in Dover, especially the ones that probably would have been the most helpful, were missing. And all the tapes that had to do with development were blank. So I was trying to fill in details of places where some of the data was not available to me. So what I was doing while I was doing this project was trying to create timelines of all these different events that are happening. A lot of the people in Dover didn't even realize that their water and sewer systems were separate, that they somehow thought that a lot of people I interviewed thought that the boil order was put in place because of the sewer system. There's just a lot of sort of confusion. And it makes sense because so many things were happening. They have a fire that burns down much of their community and almost takes out their entire community. They're trying to incorporate, they're trying to get grants for low-income communities. But what I found was a newspaper article that literally explained in one article what happened. The city of Dover, when their sewer system is red tagged in the mid-90s, needs to rebuild it. They get the grants to rebuild it, but they're required to have a place to put their new sewer system. And they go to the mill, the owners, and ask to buy 12.5 acres at the appraised value so that they can put in a sewer system. And the short version is that the mill owners refuse, and they take them to court and they refuse to sell using eminent domain. And it's actually a court order that the city of Dover is required to rezone the community as the land to a planned use development in order to buy those 12 acres to fix the sewer system. And I think this is an important moment to really sit and consider that by advocating responsibility for their water system, the mill owner's water system, and that decline created these crises that brought Dover to where it was. By building a new sewer system, just like the water system before it, it made the mill site more valuable. The property owners at the mill site know they can't profit from the land without getting the city to rezone it. So they use the city's failing sewer system as leverage to force the city's hand on zoning. and it's backed by the courts. So this new sewer system is built in the wake of this. And like the water system, it's funded using federal grants for low-income communities, but it makes the mill site much more valuable. In other words, the mill owners saw huge financial gains because they failed to provide drinkable water to the people of Dover and because they refused to aid the town's sewage crisis. The mill owners abdicated all responsibility for the community and allowed the infrastructure to crumble to the point that it required these massive grants. And as a reward for their negligence, the mill owners sold their now valuable land for millions. This was a property that was essentially gifted by the federal government to corporations. And now the owners made this huge profit off of sort of the suffering of this community. And that brings me to sort of to the final step here. After the exhaustion of resources, capitalism requires a spatial fix, a creation of new openings for fresh accumulation in new territories and spaces. So after the land was rezoned, for a long time, nothing happened. And the community of Dover sort of waited and watched to see what would happen. Most people today, all these years later, think the development is largely well done. There are miles of public trails and a new city hall, and many people have sort of let go of the fact that the city beach that they had grown up going to is not theirs anymore. But it does seem like certain things have become more painful. For one thing, one of the ways that the local people or the old timers have responded is by renaming the beach Goose Shit Beach. So the beach the developer put in, they call it the Slot Bottom Goose Shit Beach. And they say it's no replacement for the beach of their youth. Tim Caston had grown up in Dover, and when we talked about the beach, he said, I was obviously disappointed that the city beach didn't stay where it was. I can understand the developer doing that, and I will give him credit. At least he set aside an area for us. I appreciate that, but it's not the same. It's not the same as Dover Beach and having our little nighttime bonfires there and getting up on those bluffs and jumping into the water. Then one of the land planners for the development was sympathetic to a point, and he acknowledged that there will be change and it will be very, very difficult. And I think it's more difficult in this neck of the woods from my experience than in other areas, because you have people that have been residents for 80 years, and that's the way it's been. We tried to look at the old beach as a potential spot, but they have a beach. It's not like it was taken away. And he points at the map and says, it was just transferred to a better opportunity. But some of the old timers felt different. Sharon Miller, who I interviewed, I walked in her front door and she just, without any hesitation, just said, you're here to talk to me about the development? I don't care. If I ever saw the owner of that development, I'd say, you did a sin. And then offered some more very colorful commentary for the rest of our interview. That frustration is born from many residents of what feels very much like a double standard. As one resident poetically said, there was a freedom, which is gone now. It's all heavily regulated by people who don't want to comply with the regulations. Because remember, the town of Dover was without drinkable water for 6 years, and they could not legally compel the owner of the mill site to provide it. Yet they were forced to rezone. And in that process, the development came with drinkable water. So this is a picture in the community hall from one of the potlucks I attended. There are almost no communities in Idaho that look the way they did a generation ago. Instead, there are two paths that most communities have followed: rapid population loss or rapid population growth. The development in Dover is almost a perfect case study of growth in rural communities. As the jobs from extractive industries disappear, some communities are reinvented, and as long as they have the scenery and amenities to appeal to those who can afford to become permanent tourists. Since the 1980s, communities with, quote, high levels of natural amenities, such as Dover, have been transformed by this influx of, quote, amenity-driven rural population growth. This shifting vision, the shifting vision of nature and what the role of nature is, has intensified since the 1980s and 90s. So I think these are some of the important kind of contradictions that the people, the newcomers and the old timers are trying to grapple with. So at the same time that mechanization and globalization were transforming extractive industries in the West, the supposedly endless West began to feel limited. The interstate highway opens up, and there's a growing environmental movement promoting conservation and protection. Animals are being listed on the Endangered Species Act. And perhaps under different political or economic conditions, these changes could have reshaped the West in different ways. But under the system we have, beautiful natural landscapes became increasingly viewed as important commodities. One scholar notes that affluent Americans saw the vanishing West as something they needed and could afford. So rather than seeing the forests and raw materials as fuel to the economy, these spaces became much desired commodities, a means to demonstrate wealth and values by recreating in nature. So by extractive industries then had this contradictory created this system where suddenly land becomes valuable, precisely because it seems scarce, right? Because the environmental movement is creating this this kind of cultural belief that we need to protect these spaces. It becomes a valuable resource for people who can afford to buy it up. This website for the development is almost a perfect distillation of what amenity migration looks like for many communities, as it rattles off lists of recreational opportunities, lucky enough for those who live in Dover. If Old Dover was about producing, the development is about consuming, especially consuming the natural world. The trails and parks, the public beaches in the development are spaces that encourage residents to commodify their relationship to the land by doing outdoor recreation. And many of these recreations reflect very class values about the appropriate use of space. The photos are people skiing, paddling canoes, on motorboats, and on paddle boards. This community, of course, was designed with a particular social class in mind. For residents of Old Dover, boats were for fishing, recreation in the service of, or maybe under the auspices of, producing. And boats were the source of some of the most intense contention that remained in the community, voiced by older residents, who claimed that the developer had promised them that they would be able to launch their boats for free. And instead, they were forced to pay a $25 price tag to launch their fishing boats. For Old Dover residents who wanted to launch old beat-up fishing boats, the fee was part of a larger cultural change that had transformed their town. Amenity migration reorganizes rural spaces for consumption, transforming relatively open and unregulated spaces into more controlled spaces where nature has been packaged for consumption and monetized. These spatial transformations create real barriers across social class, as spaces in the New West are organized to suit the leisure and recreation needs of the affluent. Dover may have avoided being a gated community, which was one of the residents' biggest fears. But you don't need gates to keep people apart. So just as amenities in the New West create class-based boundaries between newcomers and oldcomers, environmental rhetoric often reflects assumptions of the affluent. In Dover, the fallout from the development's supposedly ecologically sound design meant a bigger burden was often placed on the shoulders of working class old-timers, furthering divisions. So as the developer in Dover blew up the bluff to lay foundations for homes, filled wetlands to build roads, and cut towering trees for the condos, they also claimed they were in fact the true stewards of the land, that they were cleaning it up after the mill left. The land planner for the development pointed out that, quote, "We did an environmental impact, wetland assessment, and so many other previous studies to really look at this from an environmental perspective. These assessments," he argues, "fostered a responsive design for the development that worked with the natural landscape instead of demolishing it." Environmental protections were at the center of the development from his perspective. Of course, as many scholars have noted, amenity migration and development often bring with them serious environmental concerns. More roads mean more runoff, more houses mean less open spaces, and more lawns mean more herbicides. This is not to deny that the land planner and other designers weren't responsive to the environmental concerns, but these concerns were put in place to mitigate the increased population, which would inevitably put more stress on the ecology of the old mill site. Being sensitive to the environment may have been a factor in the design of the development, but it wasn't so important of a factor that they may have questioned the environmental impact of expanding at all. In addition, the environmental assessment conducted by the developer wasn't optional. It wasn't an ethical decision he made. It was required by law. But for the residents of Old Dover, they found that legally mandated environmental protections did not necessarily protect their community, and that they really had very little legal recourse as they went along. So, for example, one of the more surprising things I found as I was trying to understand the development was in a conversation with the person in charge of mapping the wetlands. I was trying to understand how much of the wetland could be filled in without a permit and what had happened in this development. And it took a while for me to understand and for him to explain, but in short, the developer could only fill in 1/10 of an acre without getting additional permitting, but wrote the permit in such a way that every lot that was sold could fill in 1/10 of an acre, which meant that, you know, if there's 300 lots, that's 30 acres that can be filled in on this site. The impact of this in practice in the community was that one old timer had his horse pasture begin filling with water as the development came in, and that the part of the horse pasture that filled with water was more than 1/10 of an acre. So now if he wanted to fill in his horse pasture, which had never flooded before, it is going to require him to get a permit to fill in what is now a new wetland on his land that didn't used to exist. And when I talked to the wetland, I can't remember his title, but the guy who was in charge of the wetland process, he said that that is exactly what happens in North Idaho, and that it hadn't surprised him that this horse pasture had been flooded. Complaints about the EPA from old timers may seem like general anti-environmental complaints, but this example suggests the reality of many environmental regulations. They're designed to protect the watershed, but sometimes end up allowing people with power to skirt the rules and leaving the guy upstream to feel their impact. Another government regulation that old timers complained about was that the developer was forced to put riprap along the shores of the river, and that's what made it impossible for them to put their boats in. So the site of development was considered an important archaeological site, and because the marina was going to create a lot of wave action, they had to riprap the banks of the river. And that means that the old timers can't put their boats in the river anymore. That's not a problem if you live in the development and you can afford to pay $25 every time you want to launch your boat. But for many of the old timers, $25 was just too steep a price to pay. And so they could no longer boat in Dover. So we often, I think, embrace a really overly simplistic understanding of change in the West, that we think that the working class residents don't care about the environment with their axe hacking of trees and timber mills, and newcomers, on the other hand, are assumed to value open spaces because they're good at sorting their recycling. But the result of these assumptions are that working class people are increasingly pushed out of conversations about how land should and can be used. The logic of development, of course, is not organized around protecting the environment, but about monetizing it. And that was something that came through in all my interviews with the developer. Under this logic, the solution to scarcity is to buy it up more quickly, creating this feedback loop where every acre that's bought makes the next acre more valuable. It becomes apparent that those with wealth deserve these acres because they will protect the natural resources from working class folks who don't care about the environment. Developers did not invent this logic, but they can exploit it in the ways that we frame amenity migration. And if this is what environmentalism looks like in the New West, it's hardly surprising that working class rural communities have largely turned their backs on it. You know, most of the critiques of the development in Dover can be batted away by an appeal, well, these are private property owners and they can do what they want. And that was certainly something I heard from some of the newer residents in Dover, although not most of them. Most of them were pretty sensitive to what had happened and the change. But one person told me, this has always been private property, and I think people forget that. Just because they could always come here doesn't mean it would always be the case. And yet the development itself ushered in a whole slew of changes to this community. And I just want to talk about a couple of those. One was the Dover picnic, which the people of Dover, the old timers in Dover, decided they were going to try to continue to have even after the development put in place. And it was actually one of the new residents who told me just how incredibly awkward and painful that picnic had become. He said it was kind of funny. You could tell who was from Old Dover and who was from the development. People of Old Dover had their Carhartts on and their blue jeans and suspenders. And on the development side, there's the guy from San Diego with his polo on and his glass of wine. It was all the things you would imagine would happen in a place like this. And we don't have those picnics anymore. A former city worker in Dover pointed it to the picnic as one of the old traditions that have gone by the wayside. Another example of this was something that flared up in the summer of 2017. An old-time resident went and helped his grandpa try and clean out his garage. And the garage cleanup drug into the second week, and the new mayor was not happy with the mess that she saw. So she called the sheriff, who showed up. The newspaper got involved. The mayor was described as seething as she's telling this guy he needs to clean up the mess on his driveway. And I remembered when I'm reading this newspaper story, the city council minutes from like 30 years ago in Old Dover, where some of the city councilors are noting that one of the yards in town is looking pretty messy and they're not sure what to do about it. And their solution was to, and this is a quote, to talk to his mother and drop some hints. So in a close-knit small community, that's how you can deal with a yard that's starting to look maybe a little chaotic. You talk to somebody's mom. In 2017, in contrast, when the mayor called the sheriff, he told her there was nothing to be done because there were no city regulations. So she passed City Ordinance 158, which declared that no junk shall be kept, accumulated, or stored within the public right-of-way, public property, or in open on private property. So these kinds of ordinances suggest the logical inconsistencies at work in this place. Old-time residents are told that their beloved beach that they'd raised children on was always private property, and they have no rights to it. And yet now that development is built, the city can also decide to pass an ordinance criminalizing garage cleaning on private property. There are so many ways to measure change in the rural West. But how do these changes measure the loss of camaraderie and community cohesion? We can compare the price of housing or the number of people who've come and gone. We can measure the jobs created and what those jobs pay, elaborate pro-con lists. But how do you measure relationships that never solidify because people don't come together in public spaces? These are elusive but important components of the community are etched in the old photos from the 1930s on display in the Dover Community Hall. And it was startling to realize that I had interviewed people who were in their 80s and 90s who were peering back at me as children. My attempts to articulate this sort of indefinable sense of loss, my work attempts to articulate this sort of indefinable sense of loss. And instead of measuring our world with coffee spoons, parsing out the changes in median home prices or average wages and pretending that's what makes a community function, I wanted instead to explore how the development transformed the sense of community. Old Dover had been shedding residents for a long time. There were very few people my age who still lived in Dover. I interviewed one of them, and he said he was trying to think of the people who had remained. He was going through the list of all the people that we had all ridden the bus with, and he could only think of 2 people who'd stayed in Sandpoint in Dover. And they're mostly working construction, he said, handyman stuff. His sister works for the local salad dressing company. Old-time residents still call Dover home, but unlike their parents and grandparents, they are not neighbored by generations of their family members. And it seems like they will likely be the last generation of their families to call Dover home. And that was mostly because their children were priced out. For Sharon's children, or for one of the women I interviewed, children and other relatives, the decision to live elsewhere wasn't about personal choices. They just couldn't afford it. A modest 2-bedroom manufactured home in Dover cost $200,000. One family had a large lot and they wanted to move their granddaughter's trailer onto their property. But because of some of the changes that came in with the development, it's now $15,000 to hook up to the sewer system alone. And so she put her trailer somewhere else. These changes are pretty typical of rural gentrification. For many, sociologists call it intergenerational displacement. So as older residents are sort of locked into their homes and their children and grandchildren are forced to move elsewhere to find affordable housing, it means that these kind of intergenerational families are disrupted. I found that many folks had a really hard time articulating why these changes were difficult. Because who's going to be against walking trails and grassy lawns and a new fancy city hall? And naming that discomfort was difficult, especially in a culture that venerates the class values of the middle class and the affluent. So instead, the residents of Old Dover ruminated primarily on broken promises, challenging their disillusionment to the idea that had the developer just listened to them and fulfilled his obligations, then the community could have stayed strong. But the patterns of amenity migration and the changes brought by forever tourists are not simply designed with community cohesion in mind. There are not systems intended to bridge gaps between rural working class populations and the more affluent populations that want to make some rural areas their homes. Even a development such as this one, which did seem to try its best within this logic, is not intended to forge this kind of community cohesion. Just as Old Dover was never built with the stability of the community in mind, it was built to supply labor. The development was not built with the needs and desires of the working class in mind. Dover Bay, then, is a simulacra for an American West that never existed. It is old-timey street lamps and fountains set against the scenic beauty of the rivers and the mountains. And what happened in Dover is happening across the Pacific Northwest more broadly. Communities that undergo processes like this are sometimes referred to as lucky, since the alternative is often to sort of be erased off the map. But the winners of these processes talk about rural revitalization, while we know the process is inherently uneven. Wealth returns to areas that were previously exploited in boom and bust cycles by people who accumulated wealth elsewhere. And when wealth returns, it must extract the resources of the community again. But today, instead of clearing timber, workers clear tables, and they fight to survive in an especially exploitive service economy, where Idaho set the minimum wage for tipped workers at $3.35 an hour. For residents of Old Dover, this doesn't feel much like a revitalization. Sometimes this anger at the injustice finds its way to environmentalists, despite evidence indicating that the timber companies themselves abandoned the communities in their futures. This anger is amplified by those who claim that tourist-based economies are more ecologically sound. But more important, such claims suggest that the human suffering of people left behind is an acceptable price to pay to protect the natural world. It suggests having a beautiful place to tootle around on a motorboat or ski is more important than people's ability to provide for their family. The processes and histories that brought the development to Dover and other developments to other communities are often hard to discern. They are obscured behind the notions of the market, and this often leads to anger from working class people, but it's an anger coupled with frustration. the folks of Old Dover learned a long time ago that their rights as a community were never going to outweigh the prospects of profit. They had gleaned stability and prosperity when their labor was key to those profits. But now that landowners profited by marking the scenic beauty of the landscape, there is no longer a place for them. But we have resigned to calling this progress. So I wish I had a simple PowerPoint with 3 things that you could do to apply this theory and make life a little bit different. But that's not what sociology does. And sometimes I feel frustrated with that. But my discipline is often about trying to see the world more clearly. And it often asks us for a bit of a paradigm change. I remember when I was interviewing the land planner for the development, and I asked him, why didn't you just make the roads a grid system? Like, why not grid Old Dover and New Dover into each other? Because that was the development in the old community didn't interface very well. And he was very patient with me, but I could tell he thought that was a very antiquated question, that communities are not built on grid systems anymore. They follow the contours of the land. And when I was thinking about where my book fits in with this idea of land planning, it occurred to me that maybe what I'm asking is a similar kind of paradigm shift to thinking about how roads should be built, grid systems versus contours of the land. That some of these things require sort of us to rethink how we see the world. And it's my belief that in planning communities, we have to consider questions like, where will the people who cut our hair live? Where will the people who bag our groceries live? What about the people who teach our children? Where will they recreate? And how will we create communities where the lives of all the people in our communities are intersecting in places where we are able to create community instead of creating these sort of divisions? And so that's where I'm going to end us. I can see there are questions piling up here and in the chat. Okay, so, okay, let's see the question. So, has the city of Dover itself worked to bridge the gaps between the old timers and the new timers? I think that's an interesting question. I think in some ways it reflects the divisions that we've seen. So pretty shortly after the development was built, the old mayor, who had lived in Dover for a long time, was considered an old timer. He'd been the mayor for 20 years, stepped down. And one of the people who had probably the most prominent lakefront mansion became mayor. And so we saw a lot of sort of division on the city council. I follow this small town's politics probably too closely. They have someone running for city council or for mayor right now that I think can help bridge some of those divides. But I think, it was it's interesting the way that the development is built and the way the city is built. The city buildings for the city of Dover are built on the far edge of the development. And so, the developer's office was in the city council building. So I think the lines between kind of what was city and what was development were sort of confusing for me. And I think they were sort of confusing for the people of Old Dover. And I know the people of Old Dover felt really vulnerable, like after the law, or after the junk ordinance was put up. One of the people I interviewed said she was afraid to hang her laundry outside because the city was going to come and get her. So I don't think that the city has helped, but I'm hoping that, with some of these that there may be some changes. Okay. Comprehend. Do you think comprehensive is there anything to address these? I mean, when I looked at the city, from my perspective, when I looked at the planning, there's a lot to like about the development that happened in Dover. the people of Dover were really afraid that they were going to get a gated community. They had been told, I wonder if I'm ready to stop share and just see this. They had been told, or they had been threatened with a gated community. So the idea that they were able to stop a gated community and to bring in a developer who was local to the community, many of them knew, he'd played on the Dover River Rats baseball team, was important. And it was interesting, like if you talk to people on the development side, they claimed like, well, we provided all these resources to the community. If you talk to the people on the city council, they were like, we forced the developer's hand and we got a new city hall. So everybody took credit for the best parts, these kind of community things. But one of the things that just struck me, and this is why I'd asked one of the land planners about how the roads interfaced, was that Old Dover is largely bypassed, right? So when I think about like ways and spaces that people from the two communities might come together, like it was literally the roads kind of bypass Old Dover. And in some ways that's great because they don't want all that traffic coming through. But the community is built in a way that Old Dover feels very much like it's not part of the development that was put in. Do you think their comprehensive plan has done anything to address these issues and divides? No, I don't think so. Oh, and there's things in the chat. Okay. Oh, somebody's. Okay. I think these are not. These are the hard questions, I think, and these are questions for all our different disciplines. What are our responsibilities to community? What do we want our communities to look like? And I think the logic of development is often at odds with the logic of community cohesion, but I don't think it has to be. What are my thoughts regarding small towns? And I feel like Priest River is just starting, but has an active mill. Separation between old residents and new residents. So one of the things that was interesting in Dover for me was that I had anticipated that the old timer residents would have been the ones who fought against the development. So there was a very pretty knockdown, drag out fight over the development in Dover. Newspaper articles. At one of the things that kind of attracted me to this was the final article where it said that residents had torn up all the pamphlets at the last city council meeting that the developer had brought, and people were crying. And those weren't the old timers who did that. The old timers were largely resigned that something had to change in their community. And I think they felt like the values that were important to them were not highlighted in the development. I know one of the big fears is that and I don't know if there's any truth to this, but I heard this over and over from the old timers, was that they're going to change the name of Dover to make it sound fancier. They're going to change the name of Dover, the city of Dover, to Dover Bay to like highlight the lakiness of it. And they were just devastated to think that this community that they had helped to found was going to lose its name. So I think being able to bring people into those conversations, I never heard any evidence that they were going to change the name of the community, but nobody had from the city or from the development had ever gone and talked to them to know that those were their concerns and to help them just say like, oh, that would be really frightening. Let's talk about that. No, we don't want that to happen either.
Brianne, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. We still have some more time for questions. I see your presentation has really created a lot of great discussion in the chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep up with both the chat and the questions.
Yeah. We'll hold on the line for a few more questions as they come in. Do you have any other final thoughts while we wait for a few more questions?
Just that I think that this is a really important moment because of COVID in certain ways. One of the things that sociologists talk about is that, well, it's not a predictive science, sociology is not a predictive science, but that we expect social change. People often think of social change as like linear, right? That it's like this curve or this, line. But what we actually see is it's very fast and then it plateaus and really quick change. And we are in a moment of that in Idaho, which you all know your whole conference is kind of organized around that. But I think COVID and work has changed work arrangements in really fundamental ways. And I think the world is in such flux that it gives us a lot of possibilities in this moment. I keep thinking, often my experience of working with communities and development is that developers come in, they find a land and they present to the city, like, this is what the changes we'd like to see happen. And what if we just fundamentally rethought that? What if all developments were required to bring in all the restaurant workers from a community and have an open forum for what can you afford? What would you like your housing to look like? What needs do your children have? We know you work really odd hours. How are you going to afford childcare? And I think we need to understand and help, especially people who are moving in, amenity migrants, understand that their fate is tied up in the fate of all the people in their community, right? It's not that fun to be in Sandpoint right now when none of the restaurants are open.
Yeah.
Right? That the fate of working class people affects us. And I hate to, make it like that transactional, because in my mind, I think what I tried to do in this book was to try not to make it transactional, to try and give real time to people's feelings and what it's like to feel displaced from your community and how painful that is. And that emotional argument is not effective for everyone. But I think the business case model, you need people to run the marina, you need people to work in restaurants. And if they don't have anywhere to live, it's not going to be a very functional community. And we've seen that dysfunction in other places. And so maybe working in our communities to think this is something that we're going to center.
Well, that's what I found so refreshing about your book for me. And I'll tell you, it really did connect with me on an emotional level. And of course, I know people from Dover and I live next to Dover, but I think it would have that impact on anyone. So I would encourage everyone to get a copy of this book. And just to point out again that your swag bag that will be coming, we'll have a discount code thanks to Ryan, and the first 50 registrants will get a free copy, and that's also coming. So we'll leave it open for a couple more.
It's very exciting to me that my book is going to be in a bag with hats. When I was toiling away, it never occurred to me that I would reach this level of success. So thank you for making that happen, Aaron.
Well, thank you for finding 50 of them in a warehouse somewhere was it New York or something?
Yeah, Pittsburgh. I was getting kind of salty, told these people months ago that we'd have these books for them. So
really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we do have I can see a question mark here in the chat. So it seems this is a story of small and large communities as communities go from an economy of primarily a single resource to a more diverse economy. Seems like the takeaway is that we need to be aware of the winners and losers of policy decisions as communities change. Would an analysis of winners and losers be valuable for proposed developments, be a tool planners could use to help leaders make decisions?
Yes. I mean, I don't know what happens as a sociologist. That's what I think about constantly. So yes, and I think that happened in Dover to a certain extent. But I think what happened in Dover was that, there were certain things that were really important to the local people. And one was that boat launch. They were told, and I found newspaper articles where it says that, but most of the records were blank and things. So that was going to be my gift to the city of the people of Dover. I was like, I'm going to sit and listen to 26 hours of tape recordings and transcribe these, and I'll find out where that is and I will give it to them. And then they will at least be able to say, we know for sure that this was said. But that boat launch, like it just was a source of so much hurt for them. And in some ways it seems like such a simple, and maybe I don't understand the economics of it, but a simple thing to give the people of Dover a tag to let them launch their boats. But I think their feeling was that they were seen as not classy enough to be in New Dover. They had been told that like they were leaving too much mess on the docks from their fishing, and so they were asked not to fish on the docks anymore. And so I think trying to work with people and find, a lot of times people don't want much to feel like they're part of the community.
Yep, looks like we have one more question. How to protect housing affordability from cash-rich metro area folks moving in and driving housing costs way up? That is a big question.
That is the question.
Yeah.
I don't know, but if we can't figure that out, I think what's helpful is we can look at places, we know what's not working. We can look all over the I-5 corridor, like Bend and other places have had this happen before. Whatever they did, we should not do that because it doesn't work. I think what's hard in Idaho is I think we have even in some ways less political will than maybe in other places to address these questions, but maybe in some weird way, it's an opportunity, right? And that's why I think I've spent a lot of time in my book trying to frame the values, the working class values that helped organize North Idaho, because I think those are effective kind of organizing tools for communities. Here are our values. We have always worked towards building community for each other. We want to have everybody be part of our community. Those market forces we have given them inalienable rights in the US in this particular moment. That's part of one of the second chapter of my book. One of the things I try and talk about is these boom and bust cycles that we're seeing. People have lived in North Idaho for at least 10,000 years. And it's only been in the last 100 years that we've been dealing with this intense boom and bust. And so maybe it's okay for us to sit and imagine that doesn't have to be our future. I think part of these are kind of epistemological, conceptual problems. What if we just allowed ourselves to imagine something different? What would we build if we put ourselves in that space?
You're correct that I just want to weigh in real quick about the constraints in Idaho, particularly around housing. So, for example, one tool that is employed by a lot of other states is called inclusionary zoning, right? Where either you pay a fee to go towards a affordable housing trust fund, or you have to include a certain amount of units. That's something that can be incentivized, but it can't be required in the state of Idaho. It wasn't another question, but there's another comment coming in here that I just kind of wanted to offer up, because I think it's particularly poignant for planners. Planners have to become comfortable with a full range of emotions on community feelings. We work in a system that assigns people to sides of a conflict. We start with conflict and then offer mediation rather than starting with mediation. You have any thoughts about that comment? I thought it was.
I have so many thoughts as a social scientist about that this is about, oh gosh, I'll probably, you invited a sociologist, partially this is about gender, right? Thinking about that emotions are not things that we need to think about and plan, and that they are the heart of a community. How we feel about each other and our communities are at the heart of them. So I think they should be, a starting place, not an ending place. And I think even this idea that everybody's going to be mad, doesn't have to be true either. I was surprised that people of Old Dover were really open to development. They realized that their community was not going to exist without it. There were some people who were very upset about it. They tended to be sort of the newer comers. But the way things happen, I think especially that court order that just made everything happen so fast and so quickly was really upsetting and confusing to people. I find it confusing too. I'm like, doesn't that violate local law? Like, in some ways, it violated their own zoning laws to like this court order circumvented the process that was supposed to happen to approve rezone. So I mean, just, you know, there were so many parts along the way where these big emotions hit social structures.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come up. Well, thanks everyone. Looks like we're a few minutes early, unless there's any last minute questions or comments that anyone wants to interject with. But Ryan, thank you so much again for offering your book up as a keynote speaker for us to share physically and as part of this presentation. I thought that was having read the book, I thought that was a really great storytelling of it. I was absolutely enraptured by all the old photos you were sharing through the way, which really added to the experience of reading the book for me. And with that, I'll leave it to you to sign off, and any other final comments.
Nope, I just appreciate the opportunity, and good luck to all of you out there.
All right, thanks. Oh, what do we bring and keep the spirit of community? I think that is the root of addressing. What do we do to bring and keep the spirit of unity, in all caps?
I mean, I'm gonna be totally old school here, but like Jane Jacobs talks about this so well, right? You need people coming together in places and spaces. You need those places I think about, you know, I have 3 kids, they're in public schools. And I think there's something to me that's so magical. And I'm such a nerd about this. Like when I go to the gym and I watch a cross country meet or whatever I'm doing in these kind of community spaces, I feel like I am a member of this community. We are all doing these things. We all have the same goals. This feels so good. And I think that while the city of Dover built these community spaces, they didn't preserve some of the spaces that were really important to the community. And one of the critiques I heard, and I think it's a pretty legitimate critique, is, yeah, they built us a new city beach, but it's as far as possible from Old Dover. It's the farthest point away from Old Dover. And so the people from Old Dover have to drive to get there, right? There aren't sidewalks that interface. Like, I think part of this is a design issue, right? How do we help people? And I think when we think about recreation, what the new residents do for recreation, what the old timers do for recreation, they don't interface very well. And I think about this a lot. I'm, you know, I grew up more Old Dover, I'm more New Dover now, right? In my economic class. But that when I'm out hiking or doing something and I see someone on a 4-wheeler, I try to remind myself, like, oh, we're both enjoying outdoor spaces. And I sit at a desk all day, so I like to move my legs. That guy probably is on his feet all day. And so he wants to be outside and he doesn't want to be walking everywhere. And if we care about having recreational opportunities, we have to figure out a way for us to enjoy these opportunities together. And I think thinking about how people can use spaces and how developers can create spaces for people to come together. And while I give the developer in Dover a lot of credit for working on that, there are not those kind of spaces. And I think the picnic is indicative of that. You know, people come together and they sit at 2 different sides of the table, and there are not moments for them to come together around shared questions or concerns. It becomes very bifurcated. So space, both physical space, but also like emotional spaces for that.
I remember Jane Jacobs talked about being comfortable around strangers. And when you mentioned Jane Jacobs, I thought about that quote of hers in the picnic, which apparently wasn't the case. Ryan, thank you again so much. That was a really good talk, an important one.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.